3 months ago, a maid killed Tony Romano's son. Sofia Gustavo knew this the way every worker in the mansion knew it, not because anyone said it out loud, but because of what came after. The silence that moved into the house like a permanent resident. The security screenings that shifted from weekly to daily. The new rule that nobody discussed, but everyone understood. That Tony Romano now looked at every person inside his walls the way a man looks at something he is already planning to remove. He just hadn't decided when yet. Sofia had survived 3 months under that look, by being the most invisible person in the building. She was on her knees in the east corridor at 11:40 at night, working a grout brush between marble tiles that were already clean. She had cleaned them twice. But Gerald, Tony Romano's head of household, he had told her during her first week that the east corridor was inspected personally every Thursday morning. That Mr. Romano ran his finger along the grout line and said nothing when it was clean, and said one word when it wasn't. Nobody wanted to hear that one word. So Sofia scrubbed, head down, hair pulled back so tightly her scalp ached, uniform pressed, cleaning cart organized to the exact specification in the 40-page manual every worker received on their first day and was tested on during every monthly review. She had memorized that manual the way other people memorized prayers. Because in this house, the manual wasn't procedure. It was survival. 2 years she had kept herself invisible inside these walls. 2 years of yes sir, and of course, and right away, to spoken to floors and middle distances, and the space just beside whoever was addressing her. Never direct eye contact, never familiarity, never a single moment that might make Tony Romano's gaze land on her and stay. She was furniture. She had worked very hard to become furniture. Then her phone vibrated. She ignored it. It vibrated again. Then again. 4 times in rapid succession, with no pause between them. The particular rhythm of someone who was not going to stop. Sofia's hand slowed on the brush before her mind caught up with why. Maria Gustavo did not call 4 times in a row. Her mother had raised her on the belief that patience was the quietest form of strength. Maria waited. Maria endured. Maria had never once in Sofia's memory called more than twice before giving the other person time to respond. 4 calls with no pause meant something was already wrong. Sofia checked both ends of the corridor, pulled the phone from her apron with a hand that had gone cold. Her mother's name filled the screen 4 times, like a warning written in the same word over and over. She pressed call. Maria answered on the first ring. Sofia. Her mother's voice was low and compressed, each word arriving separately, like she was rationing breath. Listen to me carefully. I need you to come, but you cannot call anyone else. No ambulance, no hospital. Do you understand me? Sofia was already on her feet. Mama, what happened? I was shot. Flat. Direct. The way her mother said everything, without decoration, without panic, as though she had long ago made peace with the possibility that sentences like this one might someday be necessary. See, it is not as bad as it sounds. But I cannot go to a hospital, Sofia. I need you to promise me that right now. The corridor felt like it was tilting. I promise, Sofia whispered. Where are you? Outside the building. Front steps. Come quickly. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be frightening. And come quietly. The line went dead. Sofia moved. She didn't think about the cameras or the shift she was abandoning or the cleaning cart sitting in the middle of the corridor like evidence. She moved through the service passage the way she had memorized it in her first week. Every turn, every door, every shadow between her and the servants' exit at the rear of the property. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside. Rain, heavy and relentless, turning the grounds silver gray under the security lights. She got to her car. She drove. The streets felt wrong in a way she couldn't name, a specific quality of emptiness that wasn't natural, that felt arranged rather than accidental. She gripped the wheel and told herself it was the rain, told herself she was projecting, told herself to focus on getting there. Her mother was on the front steps exactly as she had said, sitting upright against the railing, one hand pressed flat against her left side, coat dark with rain and something darker than rain. Her eyes were open and calm and fixed on Sofia the moment Sofia came around the corner, as if she had known the exact direction her daughter would arrive from. Sofia dropped to her knees on the wet concrete. Her hands went immediately to her mother's, pushing the coat aside, reading the wound the way she had learned in the basic first aid course she took 3 years ago, for exactly this kind of moment she had prayed would never come. "We need to move," Maria said. "I know. I'm going to get you somewhere safe." "The Romano estate." Her mother said it the way someone says the name of a place they have been avoiding for a very long time. Quiet, certain, like a door finally opening. "Take me there." Sofia looked up from the wound. Her mother was already watching her. Those dark, steady eyes holding something behind them that Sofia had never been able to name. Some old and guarded knowledge that lived permanently just beneath the surface of everything Maria said and did and chose. "Mama, it is the only place tonight." Maria's voice didn't waver. "Take me there, Sofia. Now." Sofia pulled her mother to her feet. She didn't understand yet. She would. But by the time she did, they were already inside the gates. And the first shot from outside the perimeter wall cracked through the rain like the sound of everything about to change. The gunfire outside didn't stop. It multiplied. Sofia heard it spreading across the perimeter like something alive, moving from the north wall to the east gate, then both simultaneously, then a third position she couldn't identify from where she crouched on the floor of the storage room with her mother's blood on her hands and her heart hammering so loud she was certain the walls could hear it. She had made it inside. Barely. She had brought Maria through the servants' entrance with 30 seconds to spare before Romano's security team sealed every access point in the building. She had heard the locks engage behind her, heavy, mechanical, absolute, and understood in that moment that she had not just entered the mansion tonight, she had trapped herself inside it. The storage room was small, a cot against the far wall, a metal supply cabinet, one overhead light that buzzed faintly when she switched it on, no window, no second door. The kind of room that felt safe only because nothing about it was worth looking for. Sofia pressed fresh gauze against her mother's side and taped it down with hands that would not stop trembling. Maria lay still on the cot, eyes open, breathing in that careful, measured way. Each inhale deliberate, each exhale controlled, the way a person breathes when they have decided that panic is not an option available to them. Her face was pale but composed. Her eyes tracked Sofia's movements with a quiet attention that felt less like a wounded woman watching her daughter, and more like something older and more complicated than that. "Pressure," Sofia whispered. "You keep pressure on it." Maria placed her own hand over the gauze without being asked. Firm. Practiced. Sofia noticed that, filed it somewhere she didn't have time to examine. Above them, the mansion moved like a body responding to attack. Organized, layered, every system activating in sequence. She could track Romano's security team through the ceiling by sound alone. Boot patterns, radio intervals, the particular rhythm of men who had trained for exactly this scenario and were now executing it without hesitation. Through the walls, she could hear the outside, the gunmen beyond the perimeter communicating in short bursts, engines repositioning, the occasional sharp crack of a warning shot, fired not to hit anything, but to establish presence. They were not trying to breach the walls. Not yet. They were surrounding them. And Sofia pressed her back against the supply cabinet and looked at her mother. "Who are they?" she asked. Maria's eyes moved to her slowly. Something shifted behind them. A calculation, a decision being made and unmade in the space of a single breath. "Mama." Sofia kept her voice flat and low. "Who are those men outside?" "People from a long time ago," Maria said. "That is not an answer." "No." Her mother held her gaze. "It is not." The buzzing overhead light flickered once. Held. Sofia looked at the door and then back at her mother, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 2 years of surviving inside this mansion. The specific helplessness of a situation with no clean exit. Every option she turned over in her mind had the same sharp edge. Stay hidden and pray the sweep missed this room. Try to move Maria deeper into the building and risk being seen. Go to Romano's men and confess everything, and accept whatever came after that confession. That last option she discarded before it fully formed. She had watched a worker disappear last spring for leaving a side door unlocked during a delivery. Just unlocked. Not open, not used. Unlocked. That man had been escorted off the property by 2 of Romano's guards on a Tuesday afternoon, and his locker had been cleaned out by Thursday morning, and nobody said his name after that. What Sofia had done tonight was not a unlocked door. What Sofia had done tonight was bring the war inside the gates. She crouched beside the cot and lowered her voice further. "How long have you known about this place?" Maria was quiet for a moment. Then, "Long enough." "Mama, not tonight. I'm Sofia." Her mother's voice was gentle but final, the same tone she had used to close conversations since Sofia was small, warm enough to soften the refusal, firm enough that pushing against it never worked. "There are things I will tell you. I promise you that. But not while those men are outside, and not while we are in this room." Sofia opened her mouth, closed it, because above her head, the pattern of boots had changed. The sweep that had been moving through the upper levels was coming down. She heard the service stairwell door open at the top of the lower level, 1 floor above them, then the stairs, methodical and unhurried. 2 sets of footsteps, stopping at each door, the muffled sound of rooms being checked and cleared, each one bringing them closer by exactly 1 door at a time. Sofia counted. 4 doors between the stairwell and this room. She stood, switched off the overhead light. The room collapsed into darkness broken only by the thin thread of light beneath the door. She moved to the wall beside it and pressed herself flat, one hand resting against the surface, feeling the vibration of approaching footsteps travel through the plaster like a pulse. 3 doors now. Maria reached out from the cot in the dark and found Sofia's hand. Held it without a word. 2 doors. Sofia closed her eyes, counted her own heartbeat, tried to make it slower, and failed completely. 1 door. The footsteps stopped directly outside. A pause so long Sofia felt it in her teeth. Then a radio crackle, and Romano's head of security, voice low and clipped, speaking to someone on the other end of the line. "Tell Mr. Romano the sweep is clean." Sofia's breath released silently. "Copy that." A pause. "And the demand from outside?" Another pause, longer. "They are asking for a woman. Say she came in tonight. Say they will burn every wall down to find her." The footsteps moved away. Sofia stood in the dark with her mother's hand locked in hers, and the word burning moving through her chest like something that had already started. She turned toward the cot. In the darkness, she could just make out her mother's face. Still, composed, and carrying an expression that looked less like fear and more like a woman who had always known this night was coming and had simply been waiting to see which direction it arrived from. "Mama," Sofia whispered. What did you do? Maria Gustavo closed her eyes and said nothing, which was the loudest answer Sofia had ever heard. Tony Romano did not send his men. Sofia heard his voice first, low, controlled, cutting through the lower level like something with an edge on it. Not shouting. Tony Romano never shouted. She had learned that in her first week. The quieter his voice dropped, the more dangerous the temperature in the room became. Right now, through 2 walls and a locked door, his voice was barely above a murmur, which meant the temperature had dropped to something close to absolute zero. She pressed her ear against the door and caught fragments. Every room, every corner. Nobody touches anything. Nobody speaks unless I ask a question. Then footsteps, single set, unhurried. Her stomach turned to stone. Romano's security team moved in pairs. She had observed that in 2 years of working these corridors. They always moved in pairs. He always maintained radio contact, always reported back before proceeding. That was protocol. That was the machine running exactly as it had been built to run. One set of footsteps moving alone through the lower level was not the machine. That was the man who built it. Sofia turned from the door. In the thin darkness, she could see her mother on the cot. Eyes open now, head slightly raised, listening with the same focused stillness that had been unsettling Sofia all night. Maria's hand still pressed flat against the gauze at her side. Her breathing had steadied in the last 20 minutes. The color hadn't fully returned to her face, but the gray had receded slightly, enough to make her look less like someone slipping away and more like someone choosing to stay. He's coming himself, Sofia whispered. Maria said nothing, and her eyes moved to the door. Mama, if he finds us in here? Sofia stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because finishing it required saying out loud what she had been refusing to say since she carried her mother through the servants' entrance. What Tony Romano did to people who breached his walls. What he had done before. What he would do again without losing a single night of sleep over it. I know what he will do, Maria said quietly. The certainty in those 4 words landed somewhere cold in Sofia's chest. Not the certainty of assumption or fear, the certainty of knowledge. Specific, personal knowledge. There was no time to pull that thread. The footsteps were closer now. She could feel them through the floor. A faint rhythmic pressure traveling through concrete and tile, getting heavier with each interval. He was moving methodically. She could hear a door opening and closing 2 corridors over, then 1 corridor, then the laundry room directly beside them, the sound of it being swept, checked, cleared. 1 door left. Sofia looked around the storage room with desperate eyes. There was nothing. No second exit, no window, no space large enough to conceal a person that wasn't already occupied by her mother on the cot. She was not getting out of this room without walking through that door, and she was not walking through that door without leading Tony Romano directly to everything she was trying to hide. She made a decision. She stepped out. She pulled the storage room door closed behind her with a soft click and stepped into the corridor with her heart in her throat and her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged into the most neutral expression she had owned in 2 years of survival practice. The corridor was dim. Service lighting only, half the overhead fixtures switched off for the lockdown. At the far end, 30 feet away, Tony Romano stood with his back to her, examining the laundry room door. He turned before she could speak. His eyes found her immediately. Dark. Still. The kind of eyes that didn't move the way normal eyes moved. They didn't scan or search or adjust. They simply landed and held, like a decision already made. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Miss Gustavo. His voice was exactly what she had feared. Quiet. Precise. each word placed with the care of someone who understood that words, in the right mouth, were as effective as anything he carried in his hand. "It is nearly midnight. Your shift ended 2 hours ago." "I was finishing the East Corridor," she said. "I lost track of time." The silence that followed was 6 seconds long. She counted every one. "Why are you in the lower level?" he asked. "I heard the lockdown and came down to the staff area." She kept her voice even, kept her eyes at the middle distance just beside his face, the exact placement she had perfected over 2 years of careful invisibility. "I didn't know where else to go." Tony Romano looked at her the way he looked at everything in his house, like he was measuring the distance between what he was seeing and what was actually there. His right hand rested at his side. Oh, she did not look at what it held. He took one step toward her, then stopped. His head turned slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, the kind that belonged to someone whose senses had been sharpened by years of living inside situations where missing a detail was fatal. He was listening to something, not her, something behind her, behind the door. Maria had made a sound, the smallest sound, barely a breath, barely a shift of weight on the cot. The kind of sound that would not have reached any ordinary person standing in any ordinary corridor. Tony Romano was not ordinary. His eyes moved from Sofia's face to the door behind her, then back to her face. And in that single transit, something changed in his expression. The controlled quiet of a man conducting an investigation became something colder and more absolute. He had heard it, he had registered it, and now he was looking at Sofia the way he had looked at the maid who smiled every morning and carried poison in her apron. "Step aside," he said. "Mr. Romano." "Step aside, Miss Gustavo." The gun came up, level, steady, pointed directly at her with the practiced ease of a man for whom this motion had long ago stopped requiring thought. "Now." Sofia did not step aside. She pressed her back against the door and looked directly at him, the first time in 2 years she had looked directly at Tony Romano, and said the only true thing she had left. "She is my mother. She is hurt. Please." The word "please" fell into the silence between them, like something that had no business being in this corridor, in this house, in this world. Tony Romano stared at her, and then he reached past her and opened the door. Sofia closed her eyes and waited for everything to end. What she heard instead was the sound of a gun hitting the floor. She opened her eyes. Tony Romano was on his knees. The gun was on the floor, and Tony Romano was on his knees. Sofia could not move. She stood in the doorway of that small, dark room and watched the most dangerous man in New York press both hands against the edge of her mother's cot, like a man grabbing the last solid thing in a world that had just stopped being solid. His head was down. His shoulders, the same shoulders that carried an empire without visible effort, that never once curved inward under pressure or grief or threat, were drawn tight and small and human in a way that made Sofia feel like she was seeing something she was never supposed to see, like walking into a room and finding a lion weeping. She didn't understand it. She understood nothing about the last 60 seconds, except that the gun was on the floor, and Tony Romano had put it there himself, and her mother was looking at him with an expression that belonged to a completely different story than the one Sofia thought she had been living. "You're alive," Tony said. His voice had shed everything, the control, the precision, the particular coldness that kept every person in his orbit at a carefully maintained distance. What remained underneath all of that was something raw and unfinished. Something that sounded like a man who had spent years building walls, specifically to keep this moment from reaching him. "They said you were dead. I looked. I had people look for 2 years after, and nobody could." I know, Maria said softly. I made sure of that. Sofia looked at her mother. Maria was watching Tony with open, unguarded eyes. No performance, no careful distance. The expression on her face was the one Sofia had only ever seen directed at her. The specific look of someone loving another person through the full weight of what that love had cost them. Sad and steady and completely without regret. Someone tell me what is happening. Sofia's voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Right now. One of you tell me what is happening in this room. Tony looked up at her then. And Sofia felt it. The thing she had been unconsciously avoiding for 2 years of careful, invisible work inside his house. His full attention. Not the sweeping assessment he gave every worker during screenings. Not the cold dismissal of someone who had already categorized her as furniture. His actual attention. A landing on her face and staying there with a recognition that had no business existing between a crime lord and a housekeeper he had barely spoken to in 24 months. He knew her face. Not from 2 years of passing her in corridors. From somewhere older than that. Mama. Sofia pulled her eyes from Tony and fixed them on her mother. Talk to me. Maria exhaled slowly. She pushed herself slightly upright on the cot, wincing once, a small controlled expression of pain that she shut down immediately, and folded her hands in her lap with the particular deliberateness of a woman preparing to dismantle something she spent 20 years carefully constructing. I was not always a housekeeper, Maria began. The room went completely still. Before you were born, before I was your mother, I was something else entirely. She paused, and not from hesitation. From precision. Choosing each word the way a person chooses each step across unstable ground. I worked intelligence, embedded inside the network that controlled most of the organized crime operations on this coast. My cover was domestic work, housekeeping, cooking, the kind of work that makes a woman invisible in rooms where powerful men say things they would never say if they remembered she was there. Sofia stared at her. I was very good at being invisible, Maria said, and something moved across her face when she said it. A ghost of something that might have been pride in a different life. For 11 years I was invisible. I gathered information. I tracked movements. I prevented things that the people I reported to needed prevented. I was good at my work, and I believed in it, and I told myself that was enough. She stopped, looked at Tony. Then I intercepted something I was not supposed to find. Intelligence that told me a young man connected to the Vitale organization had been marked for removal. Internal. A power shift. The kind that required eliminating anyone who might complicate the transition. Her voice remained even. Factual. The voice of a woman recounting events she has processed so many times they have lost their ability to surprise her, but none of their weight. He was 22 years old. He had done nothing except exist on the wrong side of someone else's ambition, and they were going to kill him for it. Tony had not moved from his knees. Sofia looked at him, at the stillness of him, and at the way he was absorbing every word with his whole body, and understood that he was not hearing this story for the first time. He was hearing it told out loud for the first time. There was a difference. I found him before they did, Maria continued. I pulled him out. I moved him 3 times in 4 days using every resource I had, and several I was not authorized to use. I kept him breathing until I could get him far enough outside their reach to survive on his own. She paused. When the organization discovered what I had done, I was no longer an asset. I was a liability. The word landed in the room like something physical. So you ran, Sofia said. So I ran. Maria looked at her daughter directly. I had nothing except what I could carry. I had no identity that was safe to use. I had no location that could not eventually be found. She reached out and took Sofia's hand. I had you, 6 months old, and I had the absolute certainty that the only thing in my life that mattered more than anything I had ever done or believed or fought for was making sure that the world I had just walked away from never once touched you. Sofia felt the tears before she decided to cry them. Every year, Maria said quietly, every small apartment, every job, every time I said no to questions you deserved answers to, every door I kept closed. Her grip tightened. It was never about secrets, baby. It was always about you. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing Sofia had ever sat inside. Then, Tony Romano spoke from the floor. She saved my life, he said. Simply, completely, the way a person states a fact that has been the foundation of everything they built afterward. I was 22 years old, and I had nothing and nobody, and she sat with me in a cold basement for 4 hours because I was terrified, and she didn't leave. Sofia looked at him. He looked back at her. Nobody in that room had the full picture. That was the thing Sofia kept coming back to, as she sat on that metal chair, with her mother's words still settling through her like sediment after a flood. 3 people in a small dark room. 3 separate versions of a story that had been running in parallel for 20 years without any of them knowing they were all inside the same one. Her mother knew what she had done and who she had saved. Tony Romano knew who had saved him and what it cost her. But neither of them had known about each other's connection to Sofia until 60 seconds ago, when Maria said the words, "She is my daughter," and the room changed temperature completely. Sofia had watched it happen on Tony's face. She had been watching her mother when the words came out, and then she had turned to Tony because she needed to see what a man like him looked like when something genuinely surprised him. She had half expected nothing. That same controlled stillness that absorbed everything without visible reaction. What she saw instead stopped her breath. His face had opened. Just for a moment. The way a door opens when the lock finally gives. Sudden, complete, irreversible. Something moved through his eyes that crossed from shock into something she couldn't name, and then his jaw tightened and the door closed again. But she had seen it. He had not known. He was as shattered by it as she was. Tony stood near the doorway now with his arms at his sides, and his eyes moving between Maria and Sofia with the careful deliberateness of a man reassembling something internal that had come apart without warning. He had called his physician. She had heard that much through the wall. 2 sentences, a name, 20 minutes. Now he stood in silence, and Sofia could see him processing, calculating, reorganizing 24 months of memory against a truth that reframed all of it. She knew that feeling intimately. She was doing the same thing herself. "The men outside," Tony said finally. His voice had recovered most of its usual quality, controlled, precise, but underneath it, something new was audible, something that hadn't been there before this room. "Tell me who sent them." Maria looked at him. "You already know the name." A pause. "Ferrano." "Ferrano's son," Maria corrected. "The father is dead. The son inherited everything, including the outstanding accounts." She shifted slightly on the cot, and the movement cost her a small tight compression of her lips that she shut down immediately. "He has been rebuilding the network for 3 years, quietly, methodically, closing every loose end his father left open. You are a loose end. I am the largest one he has." Maria said it without drama, without self-pity. The flat, factual tone of a woman who had long ago made peace with the weight of her own history. "I took you out from under them when you were 22 years old. In their accounting, that is not simply an operational failure. It is a debt that belongs to the entire organization. Every year I stayed alive was an insult to their authority. Tony was quiet for a moment. Sofia watched him absorb this, watched him take the information, and turn it over, and examine it the way she imagined he examined everything, completely, without flinching from what it meant. "They tracked you here," he said. "They tracked me to this neighborhood 3 days ago. I was careful, but—" Maria paused. "I am 68 years old. I am not what I was." Something moved across her face when she said it. Not grief exactly. More like the honest acknowledgement of a limitation she had been refusing to name. "When the shooting started tonight, I tried to move away from the building. Draw them in the wrong direction. It did not work as well as I intended." Sofia looked at her mother. "You walked outside on purpose," she said. "You told me you came out when the shooting started. You said you didn't know why." Maria met her eyes. "I lied," she said simply. "I walked out to pull them away from the building, away from the other residents, away from any chance of them finding your address in my belongings and going to you instead." She paused. "I was going to lead them far enough away and then disappear again. I have done it before." "You got shot," Sofia said. "Yes." A beat. "I got shot." The simplicity of that exchange, the absolute devastating plainness of it, hit Sofia somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. Her mother had walked into gunfire on purpose, had taken a bullet on purpose, and had called Sofia afterward not to explain any of that, but simply to ask her to come, knowing Sofia would come, and knowing Sofia would figure out a way to help her regardless of the cost. Because that was what Sofia did. That was what Sofia had always done. She looked at her hands in her lap and understood something she had never fully understood before. That her mother had not just been protecting her all these years, she had also been watching her, learning her, knowing exactly who her daughter had become, and trusting that person completely in the one moment when trust was the only currency left. Tony spoke from the doorway. "How long have you known she worked here?" The question was directed at Maria. His voice was even, but Sofia heard the thing underneath it, not accusation, not anger, something more complicated than both. Maria looked at him steadily. 2 years. Tony said nothing for a long moment. "You never contacted me," he said. "Ah, no. You knew I would have. I know exactly what you would have done," Maria said. "That is why I said nothing. She needed a safe place, not a target painted on her back." Her eyes held his without apology. "You are many things, Antonio, but subtle has never been one of them." Something crossed Tony's face that almost reached his eyes. Almost. Sofia looked between them, this man and this woman, carrying 20 years of history between them, like something neither had ever been able to put down, and felt the question she needed to ask, rising through everything else like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Then why here?" she asked her mother. "Of every place in this city, why his house?" Maria turned to her, and in her mother's eyes was the answer, warm and certain and heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Because," Maria said quietly, "I knew he would keep you safe, even without knowing why." The room went absolutely still. Tony Romano looked at Sofia. Sofia looked at Tony Romano. And 2 years of invisible distance collapsed into something neither of them had a name for yet. Tony Romano closed the door on everything he was feeling and went back to work. Sofia watched it happen in real time, watched the rawness that had cracked open his face in that small room seal itself back over with the particular efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years practicing exactly this. Not suppression. Conversion. Taking something personal and hot and human and feeding it directly into the cold engine of what needed to happen next. Within 4 minutes of his physician arriving, he was on the phone. Within 6, he was in the corridor outside the storage room with 2 of his senior men, speaking in low, precise sentences that carried the specific quality of instructions that would be followed without question or deviation. Sofia caught fragments through the partially open door while she watched the physician work on her mother's side. Perimeter positions, response teams, communication blackout on all external lines, and a name repeated twice with a particular flatness that made both his men straighten involuntarily. Romano. The physician was efficient and quiet. A compact older man with steady hands and the practiced discretion of someone who had treated wounds in uncomfortable locations for a very long time without asking why they existed. He worked without speaking beyond what was medically necessary. Maria bore it without complaint, her eyes tracking the ceiling with that focused inward stillness Sofia had been reading differently since the truth came out. Not patience, discipline, 20 years of it. Built so deep, it had become indistinguishable from personality. When the physician finished and stepped into the corridor to speak with Tony, Sofia pulled her chair close to the cot and took her mother's hand. The gauze was clean and properly dressed now. The color had returned slightly to Maria's face, not fully, but enough. Her breathing had steadied into something that sounded less like careful management and more like actual rest approaching. "Does it still hurt?" Sofia asked. "Yes," Maria said, simply, without the reflexive, "It's fine" that Sofia had been receiving her entire life in response to that question. Just, yes. As if the truth had become easier to say now that the larger one was already out. Sofia held her hand and said nothing for a moment. Outside the corridor, Tony's voice rose briefly. Not in volume, but in intensity. A single clipped sentence directed at someone on the other end of a phone call that clearly wasn't receiving the information well. Then silence. Then footsteps returning. He appeared in the doorway. "I need you both to move to the Upper East room," he said. "3rd floor. Interior walls on all sides. My 2 best men outside the door." Sofia looked at him. "We are fine here. Miss Gustavo?" "Sofia." She said it before she decided to. 2 years of "yes, sir," and "of course, sir," and the particular careful distance of a woman who had built her survival around, never asserting herself inside these walls, and her own name came out of her mouth like something reclaimed. "My name is Sofia, and we are not moving her again tonight. She just had a bullet removed from her side." Something shifted in Tony's expression. Not anger. She had braced for anger, had felt the ghost of every security screening, every disappeared worker, every reminder of what this man did to people who pushed back against him. What arrived instead was something she didn't have a category for. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they have been seeing one way for a very long time and are now seeing completely differently. "The upper room is safer," he said. His voice had changed slightly, still controlled, but the edge that usually lived underneath it, the edge that reminded every person in his vicinity of the distance between them, was absent. "Then bring your 2 best men here," Sofia said. "We are not moving her." A long pause. "All right," he said. Sofia blinked. She had not expected that. And he had not expected to say it either. She could see that in the brief stillness that followed, the almost imperceptible pause of a man surprised by his own response. He looked at her for one moment, longer than necessary, and then turned back to the corridor, and she heard him redirect his men with the same quiet authority as before, except now toward this location, instead of the other one. Maria's hand squeezed hers lightly. Sofia looked down. Her mother was watching her with that almost smile, saying nothing, saying everything. Outside the walls, the siege shifted. She heard it. a change in the pattern of gunfire, closer on the east side, more coordinated than the earlier exchanges. Ferrano's men were consolidating, pulling their positions tighter around one point of the perimeter rather than maintaining the surrounding formation. Tony appeared in the doorway again within seconds, his phone in his hand and his eyes sharp. "They are moving to the east gate," he said. "Not to Sofia. To Maria." Maria pushed herself slightly upright. The physician made a sound of protest from the corridor. She ignored it completely. "They are not trying to breach," Maria said. "They are compressing, forcing your men to concentrate east." Her voice had shifted, the warm maternal quality gone, replaced by something precise and analytical that made Sofia's skin rise slightly. "It is a redirect. While your team moves east, something else comes from a different direction entirely." Tony looked at her steadily. "Where?" "The service tunnel on the south side of the property." Maria met his eyes. Ferrano's father built his entire operational strategy around secondary entries. And his son learned everything from him. They will come through whatever your lowest surveillance point is. Tony was already on his radio. Within 90 seconds, the south service tunnel had 4 men on it. Within 3 minutes, the redirect attempt had been neutralized before it fully formed. Ferrano's secondary team intercepted at the exact point Maria had identified. Their approach collapsed before a single man cleared the tunnel entrance. Sofia sat in that small room and watched Tony Romano dismantle a siege using intelligence provided by her wounded mother, and felt the ground shift beneath everything she thought she understood about both of them. Then, Tony's radio crackled. One of his men. Voice tight. "One of them got a transmission out before we closed the tunnel. Short burst." He encrypted. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to be frightening. "We cannot confirm the recipient." Tony went very still. He looked at Maria. Maria closed her eyes, and Sofia felt the temperature in the room drop to something that had nothing to do with the night outside. Ferrano was at the gate. Sofia heard it in Tony's voice before she understood the words. A single sentence from his man at the front perimeter that changed the quality of the air in the corridor, the way a pressure drop changes the air before a storm. Tony went still in a way she had never witnessed before. Not the controlled stillness he carried like a second skin through every ordinary moment in this house. Something deeper than that. Something that had a bottom to it. He turned to his 2 men. "Front positions. Nobody engages without my direct word." His voice was barely above a murmur. Both men moved without a sound. Then he turned to the doorway, where Sofia stood, and his eyes moved to her, with a directness that she still hadn't fully adjusted to. 2 years of being looked through by those eyes, and now being looked at by them felt like stepping from shadow into light too quickly. "Stay inside," he said. "Both of you. I need to know you are here and safe while I handle this." It was not the cold command she would have expected from him 48 hours ago. It carried something underneath it, something careful and almost tentative, the voice of a man who was asking rather than ordering and was aware of the difference. Sofia nodded. She sat back down beside her mother's cot without argument, and Tony moved down the corridor toward the front of the mansion, and she watched his back until the darkness swallowed him. Maria's hand found hers in the quiet that followed. "He will handle it," Maria said. "I know," Sofia said, and she did know. That was the strange part. Somewhere between the gun hitting the floor and the physician's arrival, and watching Tony redirect his entire operation with Maria's intelligence, guiding every decision. Somewhere in that sequence, something had shifted inside Sofia's chest regarding this man. Not trust, exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of something that could become trust, if the night gave it enough room to breathe. She looked at her mother's face. You knew he would, Sofia said quietly. That is why you told me to bring you here, not just because it was safe, because you knew exactly who he was and what he would do when he found you. Maria was quiet for a moment. I knew who he was when he was 22 years old, and frightened, and had nothing. She paused. People show you who they are in their worst moments. Everything after that is just confirmation. Sofia sat with that. Outside, she could hear the mansion operating on multiple levels simultaneously, boots moving in coordinated patterns above her, radio communications bleeding through walls in short controlled bursts, the distant sound of the perimeter holding against whatever pressure Romano was applying from the other side. The siege had changed character since the tunnel attempt failed, less aggressive, more deliberate. The difference between men throwing force at a problem and a man deciding how to apply precision to it. Then Tony's footsteps came back down the corridor. He appeared in the doorway with his phone in his hand and his expression carrying something she was learning to read, that specific compression around his jaw that meant information had arrived, and he had already decided what to do with it, and was now simply executing the decision. He wants to talk, Tony said, looking at Maria. Maria's eyes sharpened. He called you directly? Just now. Something passed across Maria's face. Not fear, not surprise, but the particular recognition of a person hearing a move they anticipated being played exactly when they expected it. He is patient, she said. His father was never patient. The son learned something the father never had. He is asking me to hand you over, Tony said. Flat, direct, not softening it. Says it ends there. No further escalation. My operation continues undisturbed. The room absorbed that. Sofia looked at her mother. Maria was watching Tony with those open, steady eyes. Not afraid. Not pleading. Simply watching. The way a person watches someone they trust completely and are waiting to see confirm what they already believe about them. Tony looked at Sofia briefly. Something passed across his face in that moment that was there and gone before she could fully read it. Something that had nothing to do with Romano or the siege or the 20-year-old debt sitting in the room between him and her mother. Something that was specifically about her, about the 2 years behind them, and whatever came after tonight. Then he looked back at his phone. He answered the call on speaker. Romano. The voice on the other end arrived smooth and unhurried. The voice of a man who had learned that patience telegraphed power more effectively than volume ever could. Ferrano, Tony said. I trust we can be reasonable men about this. Say what you came to say. A brief pause. The woman, Maria Gustavo. She is a 20-year-old debt that my family has carried long enough. This is not about you, Romano. It has never been about you. Open your gates. Walk her out yourself. And everything that happened tonight disappears. Another pause. Precisely weighted. You have built something significant here. It would be a shame to watch it become complicated over something that has nothing to do with you. The corridor went absolutely still. Sofia's hand tightened around her mother's without her deciding to. She watched Tony's face during Ferrano's words and saw nothing move in it. No calculation, no hesitation, no flicker of the weighing of options that she might have expected from a man being asked to choose between his empire and a debt. He looked like a man listening to a question he had already answered before it was fully asked. He lifted the phone. Ferrano, he said. The woman you are looking for is under my protection. That is not a negotiation. That is not a position I will be revisiting. His voice was completely level, completely final, the voice of a verdict. Come near my gates again, and I will remind you why your father spent the last 3 years of his life regretting every decision that put him across from me. He ended the call. The silence afterward was vast and complete. Then Maria exhaled, long and slow, and carrying 20 years of held breath inside it. Sofia looked at Tony Romano standing in that doorway, with his phone at his side, and his eyes moving to her mother, with an expression that needed no translation. He had chosen, without hesitation, without calculation, without a single moment of visible doubt. Then, from outside the perimeter wall, the silence shattered. Not gunfire this time, but something more organized, more purposeful. The sound of a man who had just been told no and had decided what came next. Verano was done talking. The outer gate came down at 2:47 in the morning. Sofia felt it before she heard it, a vibration that moved through the mansion floor and up through her feet, like the building itself was registering the weight of what was coming. Then the sound followed. Heavy. Final. The particular impact of something irreversible crossing a threshold it was never meant to cross. Verano was inside the walls. She rose from the chair beside her mother's cot without deciding to. Her body simply moved, drawn toward the corridor by the same quiet force that had been pulling her toward the center of this night since the moment she carried Maria through the servants' entrance. She was done being the only person in this story who stayed where she was told. Sofia. Her mother's voice came soft from the cot. She looked back. But Maria was watching her with open, steady eyes. No fear in them, no plea. Just that deep, clear, knowing look that Sofia was only now beginning to fully understand. The look of a woman who had spent 20 years watching her daughter from a careful distance and knew exactly who she was. "He will handle it," Maria said. "I know," Sofia said. "I just need to see." Maria said nothing more. Sofia moved through the service passage in complete darkness, every turn committed to her body through 2 years of early morning shifts and late night rounds. She followed the sound of voices toward the front of the mansion until she reached the interior window overlooking the main courtyard and stopped. Verano stood 20 feet from Tony Romano. He was not what the night had built him into inside her imagination. No monster, no spectacle. A man in his mid-40s with a rain-darkened coat and 4 men flanking him, and the particular stillness of someone who had been patient for a very long time and had finally decided patience was finished. He looked across the courtyard at Tony with the flat certainty of a man who believed this conversation had only one possible ending. Tony stood alone, no men visible at his sides. But Sofia had learned enough in 2 years to know that Romano's men were never visible when they were most present. They were in every shadow along every wall, positioned and waiting for a word that hadn't come yet. "This is the last time I make this offer," Verano said. His voice carried clean through the rain. "The woman, Maria Gustavo. You walk her out through that gate yourself and everything that happened tonight is finished. Your walls stay standing. Your operation continues. Your men go home." He paused. "One woman, Romano. That is all this has ever been about." Tony looked at him. The silence between them lasted long enough that Sofia felt it in her chest. "She saved my life," Tony said. Simply, completely, the way a man states the only fact that matters in a room full of noise. "She sat on a cold floor with me when I had nothing and nobody, and she did not leave. She gave up everything she had built to keep me breathing." His voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It remained exactly what it had been all night, quiet in the way that only the most certain things are quiet. "There is no version of tonight where I hand her to you. There is no offer you can make. There is no threat that changes that answer." Verano studied him for a long moment. "Then you are choosing this," Verano said. "I already chose," Tony said. 20 years ago when she chose me. Something shifted in Ferrano's face. A compression, a tightening, the expression of a man watching a calculation fail in real time and adjusting to what came next. He reached inside his coat. The courtyard erupted. Romano's men came from every shadow simultaneously, materializing from positions along the walls, the doorways, the dark angles of the space, with a silence and coordination that was almost mechanical. Ferrano's 4 men were contained before any of them completed a motion. Ferrano himself stood with Tony's men at both sides, and Tony Romano directly in front of him, close enough that the rain falling between their faces was the only distance left. Ferrano went completely still. Tony looked at him without anger, without cruelty, with the specific expression of a man delivering something that has been a long time coming and feels no satisfaction in the delivery. "Your father made decisions," Tony said quietly. "He paid for them. That account is closed. Maria Gustavo is not a debt. She is not an outstanding balance. She is a woman who chose to be decent in a world that punished decency, and she has paid enough for that choice." He leaned forward slightly. "This ends tonight. Every account, every outstanding order against her name, every man your family has ever pointed in her direction." He paused. "This is finished. All of it. Do you understand me?" The courtyard was absolutely silent. Ferrano stood between Tony's men, with the rain coming down on his shoulders, and something moving through his face that took Sofia a moment to identify. Not defeat exactly. More like a man who had carried something for 20 years, and was only now, in this specific moment, feeling the full weight of what he had been carrying and what it had cost him to carry it this far. He nodded. Once. Slow. Complete. Tony stepped back. 2 words to his men. Low and final. It was over. The courtyard emptied with the same efficient silence it had filled. Ferrano and his men were gone from the property within 4 minutes, escorted to the outer perimeter and released into the rain with the particular understanding of men who had been shown, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly where the boundaries of their reach ended. The gate was secured. The perimeter went quiet. Just rain now. Just the sound of the storm moving through without stopping. Just the specific silence of something that had been in motion for 20 years, finally arriving at its last possible destination and stopping there. Sofia stood at the interior window with both hands flat against the glass and felt the tears come without warning, not from fear, not from relief alone, but from the full overwhelming weight of watching a man she had spent 2 years being invisible around choose, without hesitation, and without calculating the cost, to be exactly the person her mother had believed he was for 20 years. Tony turned from the empty courtyard. He looked up, directly at the window where she stood, like a man who had known she was there the entire time. The silence after the storm was the loudest thing Sofia had ever heard. She was still standing at the interior window when Tony came through the corridor door behind her. She heard his footsteps first, that familiar cadence she had memorized over 2 years of early mornings and late nights, the particular rhythm of a man who moved through his own house, like he owned every inch of it. Except tonight it sounded different, less like ownership, more like someone finding their way back to something they had been away from for a very long time. She turned. He stopped a few feet away. They looked at each other in the dim corridor light, with the rain still running down the window behind her, and the entire weight of the night sitting between them, like a third presence in the hallway. 2 years of careful distance. 2 years of eyes down and yes, sir, and the practiced invisibility she had built her survival around. All of it felt very far away right now. like something that had happened to a different version of her, in a different version of this house. Tony looked at her the way he had looked up from the courtyard, directly, completely, with that recognition she still didn't have a full language for. "It's over," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Tony said, "Your mother should not be alone." It was the simplest sentence, the most ordinary thing either of them could have said in that corridor after everything the night had produced. But it moved through Sofia's chest like something that had been waiting for exactly those words in exactly that order. Because it wasn't a command, wasn't an observation, and wasn't the voice of a man managing a situation. It was the voice of someone who cared, quietly, without announcement, the way her mother had always said her real feelings were shown. "No," Sofia said softly. "She shouldn't." They walked back together, not side by side exactly, with the careful few inches between them that acknowledged something without naming it yet. Down the service corridor, through the lower-level passage, back toward the small room where Maria Gustavo had spent the most significant night of the last 20 years on a narrow cot with a wound in her side, and 20 years of secrets finally breathing free. Tony pushed the door open gently. Maria was awake. Of course she was awake. Sofia almost smiled at herself for expecting anything else. And her mother was sitting up against the wall with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes clear and present, watching the door with the patient expression of a woman who had been listening to the silence change outside, and had understood exactly what it meant when it went completely still. She looked at them both standing in the doorway together. Something moved across her face, slow and warm, and so full it was almost painful to witness. The expression of a person seeing something they built from nothing, across 20 years of sacrifice and silence and absolute faith, finally standing in front of them, whole. "It's done," Sofia said. Maria nodded once. "I know." Sofia crossed the room and sat on the edge of the cot beside her mother, took her hands. Those familiar hands, slightly rough, slightly cool, at the most known thing in her world, and held them the way she had held them in the dark when Tony's men were outside this door and everything felt like it was ending. "Was it worth it?" Sofia asked quietly. She had not planned the question. It arrived on its own, rising through everything else the way the most necessary things always did, bypassing thought entirely and arriving directly from the place where all her truest feelings lived. 20 years of a sealed past. 20 years of careful silence. 20 years of a wall her mother built around her with her bare hands and maintained without complaint and never once asked to be thanked for. Was it worth it? Maria looked at her daughter for a long moment. "You are sitting here," she said, "whole, safe, yourself." Her voice was steady and warm, and carrying something underneath it that was beyond simple love. It was the specific piece of a person who made the hardest choice of their life and lived long enough to see it was the right one. "There is nothing in this world or the next that I would trade for that." Sofia pressed her forehead against her mother's hand. She did not try to stop the tears this time. She heard Tony move, not away, but to the metal chair in the corner of the room, sitting, staying, not intruding on the moment but not leaving either, the way a person stays when they understand they are finally somewhere they belong. After a moment, Maria looked at him. "Antonio," she said. He looked up. "You were never supposed to carry it alone," Maria said gently. "What happened to your son, the years after? All of it." Her voice was soft, but it landed with the specific weight of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to say a true thing and has finally found it. Grief that size needs somewhere to go. You built walls around it instead. That was never going to hold forever. Tony was very still. I know, he said. And the two words carried everything. 15 years of locked rooms and cold silences, and an empire built over a wound that never closed, because closing it would have required feeling it completely. Maria reached out her hand toward him. He looked at it for just a moment. This small, steady, weathered hand extended across the space between them. And then he crossed the room and took it. And Sofia watched Tony Romano, the man this city feared, and sit beside her mother's cot and hold her hand with the careful gentleness of someone who had forgotten they were allowed to be held and was only now remembering. You were a good boy, Maria said quietly. You are still that boy, underneath all of this. She squeezed his hand once. Don't let him disappear again. Tony looked down. His jaw worked against something he didn't release. Then he nodded. Sofia stood and moved to the doorway to give them the space the moment required. She leaned against the frame and looked out into the corridor, the same corridor she had run through in terror just hours ago, that now sat in complete quiet around her, like something that had exhaled. She heard Tony's footstep behind her a few minutes later. He came to stand beside her in the doorway, not close enough to crowd, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold corridor air. They stood together, looking out at the quiet hallway, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. I didn't know, he said finally, who you were. I want you to know that. I know you didn't, she said. If I had, he stopped, started again. The way I ran this house, the screenings, the rules. His voice carried something underneath it that sounded like a man examining something he had built and seeing it clearly for the first time. You deserved better than that. Sofia looked at him. In the dim light of the corridor, his face was open in a way she had only seen twice before tonight. When he first saw Maria on the cot, and when he turned from the courtyard and looked up at the window. Unguarded, present, the face of a man who had spent 15 years behind glass and was only now standing on the other side of it. My mother believed in who you were, Sofia said quietly. Before tonight I didn't understand why. She paused. I think I'm starting to. Tony looked at her. The corridor was completely still around them. And in that stillness, in the small warm space between two people standing in a doorway after the longest night of their lives, something settled, not loudly, not with declaration or drama, just quietly and completely, the way the most real things always arrived. From inside the room, Maria's voice came soft and unhurried. She was humming, an old melody, gentle and familiar, the kind that belonged to childhood and candlelight, and the belief that the people you love will find their way home eventually if you simply keep the light on long enough. Sofia closed her eyes and listened. Beside her, Tony Romano went completely still, and on his face, in the dim light of a corridor that had seen fear and fury and the full weight of 20 years of buried things finally surfacing, was the expression of a man who had just remembered what it felt like to be safe. You just watched a ruthless man kneel. Not for power, not for fear, but for the woman who chose his life when nobody else would. Maria Gustavo didn't carry a weapon. She carried something far more dangerous, a mother's love that never once gave up. If this story reached something inside you, if it made you think of someone who sacrificed in silence so you could live in peace, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. We release new stories every week, each one built to make you feel something real. And before you go, tell us in the comments, which moment broke you the most?